Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 11 of Truth is Justice. I wanted to start the episode by addressing some of the discussions during the week regarding Herman Melgar's interview with Deputy Garcia on the night Sandra was discovered. You will recall how Bob made some quite extraordinary comments regarding different aspects of the interview. Herman's words during the interview, the translation of the interview, and the nature of Deputy Garcia's involvement in the interview. The claims were extraordinary with respect to their carelessness and their absolute blatant misrepresentation of what the material actually demonstrated. But even more importantly, I think we've learnt a few very important points from how it all played out. Firstly, podcasts like ours, and like Bob's, can be very powerful in their suggestions and can have quite a significant effect on the way people view a case as a whole or individual elements of the case. Now, I've often wondered why it is that Bob likes to read large amounts of text from written material that is often, and at least in part, made available for his audience to read themselves. Now, in part, I believe it provides Bob with an effective way to add minutes to the podcast episode without much effort. So you're reading from a document, so it really requires little to no value add. But more importantly than that, I think what it is, because the reality is that Bob's show is entertainment, and a lot of people simply don't want to go to the trouble of reading large, sometimes technical documents. They're happy to simply be provided with a summary in audio format whilst going about their day, which is exactly how a podcast is consumed by many people. And I'm absolutely not criticising that in any way. There's no obligation on anyone to read anything or to do anything other than to listen and to be entertained. And that's actually how I use podcasts myself, whether it be going for a run or a long drive or simply doing some task around the home and having a favourite podcast of mine playing in the background or with my headphones on. At the end of the day, it is entertainment, which in the end is what it is all about for shows like Bob's. But what I'm critical of, massively critical of, is the way this influence is wielded. If you know people are going to take your word for something, as in not go and read the full source documents themselves, then you have a lot of power to influence and put certain scenarios in those people's minds. You can, for example, touch on only the parts that suit your narrative, which has been done frequently in this case, or as was the case with this interview of Herman's, you can entirely make up what it contains. You can put a spin on it that is entirely false. And Bob knows that at least some people will entirely believe him and not confirm the validity for themselves. And we know that is what happens, because that is exactly what has happened this week. Some people are deeply and blindly committed to the words Bob speaks, and they're arguing his points, even when they are presented with evidence, and not just by me, but by others, that shows that their argument is entirely false. I recall one particular discussion during the week where a person restated Bob's claim that Deputy Garcia injected the word hands into the interview with Herman, causing Herman to then himself start using the word hands. So to refresh your memory, it was suggested by Bob that Deputy Garcia, perhaps intentionally or perhaps not, used the word hands to try and guide or influence Herman into doing the same. As you know, the interview absolutely didn't play out like that, not even remotely. Herman had used the word hands 5 times prior to Deputy Garcia bringing it up, so unless Deputy Garcia had the ability to go back in time and somehow influence Herman's statements made earlier in the interview, then there is simply no way he could have influenced Herman's account. Yet, in this discussion, this person blindly believed it, fully convinced that because Bob had made that statement on his show, then it must be true. They weren't interested in hearing anything about what actually took place or reading the transcripts through to see for themselves. No, they were thoroughly convinced based on Bob's view and took away from Bob's comments that Deputy Garcia influenced Herman's account of the way Sandra was bound. And therein lies the huge problem. Now, Bob has now acknowledged that statements he made about the interview were wrong, and he blames it on various things: a busy schedule, inability to listen to the interview fully, taking someone else's brief comments and using those without checking them himself. But once again, in my opinion, that reflection doesn't go far enough. The damage has already been done. Some people in his audience are already absolutely convinced of something and have been quite happy to get stuck in a baseless circular argument entirely on the back of something Bob has said. In other words, some of his followers will fight to find a way to make Bob's version of the story work, even when it is completely fabricated and acknowledged as such. It demonstrates the absolute importance that accuracy plays when you're considering cases like this and trying to influence groups of people, and we've demonstrated that time and time again here at Truth is Justice. In this field, and I'm not just talking about podcasts, I'm talking about murder cases and strict legal matters, your quality and attention to detail can't be swayed by sponsors' time pressures or deadlines or the inability to fully review material. If you put the material out there for people to consume and accept it as fact, it has to be right. It has to be accurate. And importantly, you have to be accountable, especially when you spend so long arguing that others need to be accountable for their actions and then attempting to cause them significant professional damage for doing so. Whilst for shows like Bob's this is entertainment and a business, and the simple realities of sponsors and income mean that an episode has to be released on time, otherwise food cannot be put on the table, this isn't a game. Far from it. This isn't the type of thing you can approach half-heartedly and in a rush put out statements that others take at their word and then go on to potentially cause significant personal and professional damage to other people. This isn't an isolated incident with Herman's statement. This happens week in and week out, and it is the reason we are doing what we are doing here at Truth is Justice. We want to demonstrate, actually further than that, we want to prove to people how these statements are not only false and misleading, they are wholly irresponsible, and those individuals behind them, like Bob, need to be more honest with themselves and their audience about their goals and their motivations. Secondly, whilst the underlying basis for the comments made by Bob were entirely wrong, the argument didn't even work, and that should have been obvious to Bob, yet it wasn't, and he still ran with it. And why? Because it was pro-Sandra's innocence, so really, why would the facts matter? I'll explain why the argument didn't work. So 2 points were being argued by Bob. The first, that the word hands was used in place of or interchangeably with the word arms. And the second, that Deputy Garcia injected the word hands to try and somehow manipulate Herman into using the word hands more than arms. So see the problem with that? You can't have it both ways. You can't argue that the words are interchangeable or mean the same thing, and then at the very same time also argue that Deputy Garcia unintentionally injected them. It would have no meaning or no importance if Deputy Garcia injected them and they were interchangeable. Yet that is exactly what we saw. Another argument without basis, and the suggestion, although far more carefully applied in this instance than in the past, that a person involved with the case, Deputy Garcia, somehow damaged Sandra's chances at remaining free. And thirdly, Bob suggests through his comments of being entirely unaware of the number of times hands and arms are used during the interview, that he had not even read the transcripts of the interviews with Herman and Maria conducted by Deputy Garcia. Now, let's take that at its word, that Bob hadn't actually read the transcripts of the interviews. Now, that's shocking. It suggests that he has afforded no weight and no importance to witness statements which were given just hours after Sandra was discovered, and statements that he has discussed openly, and statements which he has wholly criticised. It also explains why, during his interviews with Herman and Maria, Bob failed to raise some of the glaring inconsistencies in their recollection of the events of that evening when they discovered Sandra. Now, I don't think there's any way that it could be described as a good investigation or a re-investigation, as it's sometimes referred. In my opinion, it simply represents shoddy work, which was designed only to dramatise the case and sway the audience towards Sandra's innocence and inject more conspiracy against her. It represents yet another example of Bob not being willing to confront the uncomfortable truths of this case, and come up with ways to promote the case as a wrongful conviction when the reality of the facts are entirely in conflict with that. Let's assume that the claim isn't true and that Bob had actually read the transcripts. Well, that's equally shocking. That Bob was aware of the contents of the interviews, that the word arms was only used once, yet despite that knowledge, he still pushed a lie onto his audience in the hope it would be blindly received and accepted by at least a portion of the audience. And as it turns out, it was. People did believe it, and they took Bob at his word, and Bob would have known that. It is the way he operates, and it's what we've shown every week here on Truth is Justice. And lastly, I want to quote Bob on his thoughts with respect to this latest misleading statement. And to quote Bob, "In any case, I don't think it's really an issue at all. I may have misspoke, but the entire interview was played for everyone to hear. Everyone knows what was actually said." End quote. I think those words speak volumes about Bob's approach and the way he views and acknowledges his own actions as compared to those of the people he challenges. We've heard Bob precisely dissect the words of many people connected with this case, including Ms. Barnett, the jury foreman Tom, Ms. Rossi, Mr. Carpenter, Mr. Doucet, Ms. Martinez, and the list goes on, and he has done so in a way that seeks to denigrate each and every one of these individuals, attacking them and providing encouragement for other people to attack them, and arguing his narrative through the use of interpretation of individual words that they have used. Well, here we have Bob arguing against the same, being that his blatant misrepresentation of an interview doesn't really matter. I mean, I can't quite believe that. To challenge everyone else's words and then give himself a free pass on the basis that lies and misrepresentation simply don't matter. And really, just let that sink in. Bob claims that the statements he made with respect to that interview may have simply been him misspeaking. Think about and compare it again to the level that he holds others at. These blatant misrepresentations also speak volumes about the disregard Bob has for not only the people formally connected with the case, and his own audience who deserve, expect, and are entitled to an accurate account of aspects of the case, not rushed and ill-considered claims made without any factual support. But most importantly, it shows a continuous and absolute disregard for the victim of the crime, Mr. Jaime Melgar. When the pressures of sponsorship and commercial realities mean that an episode has to be released without the due consideration and precise care that it deserves, and absolutely requires, then the person who this investigation should be about, Jim, has been forgotten amongst the spoilers and the bombshells and the general drama that has been deliberately created around it. And that is a terrible, terrible shame. Before moving on, I wanted to briefly address again the discrepancies between Herman and Maria's statements made just hours after discovering Sandra, and those made at trial, and then those made in the interviews conducted with Bob. You will recall that we addressed each of these discrepancies in episode 5 of our podcast. What is so surprising to me is that Bob hadn't addressed any of these inconsistencies until now. And I'm surprised because once again, it comes down to either not reviewing the material, in this case the transcripts of the interviews conducted by Deputy Garcia with Herman and Maria, and both Herman and Maria's trial testimony, or reviewing it and choosing to ignore it. I also highlight here that it isn't as if the inconsistencies went unnoticed. In fact, a member of ours, Danny, posted a very detailed summary of the inconsistencies months and months ago on a Facebook page associated with Bob's show, and her comments were entirely dismissed for various reasons. But in the end, likely for no other reason than because what she was saying simply didn't fit the narrative that Bob was pushing. Now, either way, it isn't good at all. You have Bob conducting an interview with Herman and Maria without any knowledge of their previous statements. And that's a terrible approach to take, because when he is provided with accounts that completely contradict previous statements, he simply accepts those as fact. Actually, not just as fact, but representing incredible new information, even describing those interviews with Herman and Maria as being game changers. Now, instead of acknowledging that the fault lay with himself for not reviewing the material, incredibly, but as we know now, entirely consistent with previous conduct, Bob takes the opportunity to once again lay into Detectives Carazal and Doucet over the lack of follow-up with Herman and Maria. With respect to these recollections, we do see how a memory can change over time and how the account of events can be completely altered. We see how Maria went from just hours after finding Sandra and confirming that all she saw on Sandra were her feet bound by a blue-green scarf, to 5 years later at trial where she recalls 2 scarves and 2 cords being used to bind Sandra's wrists and ankles, and her recollection of removing both the wrist and ankle bindings with the scissors. We also have a demonstration by Maria of how Sandra was restrained, Maria demonstrating to the jury how Sandra's hands were clasped together behind her back. And you can try this for yourself. If you have your hands clasped together, there's no way your hands can then also be near your opposite elbows. It simply doesn't work. So if you are confused by these changing accounts, well, that's because it is confusing. And in my view, it's confusing only because of what has happened since, and the pressure that has been placed on memories to perhaps more closely fit a given scenario. To be clear, I'm not at all and not in any way suggesting that Herman and Maria are not being truthful, or not sharing exactly what they believe to be the events of that afternoon. But one does see how, over time and with influence from different stories and recollections and narratives, a reasonably straightforward memory can be clouded and confused by memories that are perhaps suggested should be there. But this approach has to be applied equally and evenly across all memories. It isn't suggested, or at least not by us, that only Maria's memory could be off here. No, it's something that happens consistently across all people. So what does that mean with respect to this case? It means that all of the statements need to be considered carefully and not accepted at face value. You can't on the one hand take every aspect of Herman's recollection of the events as being actual accurate records of the events if you don't accept Maria's as being so. You also can't accept family members' claims of an almost photographic memory of the house and all of its contents if in certain respects you dismiss some of those as not being necessarily foolproof. One important question that should be asked is, why did Bob not address any of these inconsistencies with Herman and Maria during his interviews with them? My view is that it was because inconsistencies are notoriously difficult to balance, and in this case it completely contradicted the version of events we are now hearing and which Bob has been confidently presenting. In finishing this discussion of the bindings, I will say that whilst inconsistencies are very difficult to address, they have to be analysed, and they have to be incorporated into a narrative in exactly the same way that consistent accounts are. You simply can't take a single account, disregard other, perhaps not so convenient accounts, and from that build a compelling narrative. You have to look at everything. You have to take everything into account, and you have to understand the inconsistencies that appear and why they appear. I think what we have observed over the last 3 months since our involvement in this case is everyone has been able to take a more objective look at the case material. And for many, that has resulted in moving from a position of confusion, which I think was deliberately imposed and wished upon the audience, to a position of understanding that the case need only be overwhelmingly confusing if you are made to look at it from just one perspective, the perspective of Sandra's conviction being a wrongful one. As soon as you introduce everything, all of the different pieces of the puzzle, all of the inconsistencies and the changing accounts, then it becomes much, much clearer. What we are seeing now is some increasingly bizarre and complex explanations for these inconsistencies, but in the end, those explanations don't add anything of value. They're just an outcome of the full story being deliberately withheld at the start, and are scrambling now to try and plaster over the cracks which are ever widening. As we've said before, our goal in producing this podcast is to set the record straight. It is to give you all the material, without bias and without any ulterior motives, and allow you to more accurately see the case the way the jury saw it, and the way it actually is. Any other approach is simply fiction. Last week, we left the analysis of the crime scene report at the end of Bob's take on the master bathroom. But before we move into the master bathroom closet, there are some further important points I wanted to make about the master bathroom. Firstly, the various items that are kept around the jacuzzi. And notice that the jacuzzi has an inner shelf, and there are two items on that shelf. One is a bubble bath mixture, and the other is an empty container of a bath soak. Now the empty container doesn't appear to have a lid, and it's actually standing upside down. And why is that relevant? Well, look at the water level in the photos, and consider what the water level would have been when two adults were in that small space. Further, consider the movement of water in that jacuzzi when those two adults were physically active, as has been described by Sandra, and when one or both adults stood up to get out of the jacuzzi. Also, consider the movement created by the multiple jets operating and the agitation of the bubble bath mixture in the water, and then think about how that bottle that is resting upside down has managed to remain in that position throughout all of that movement. And why is that important? Because if the water level had risen to even slightly above that inner shelf, the bottle would not have remained standing. If Jim and Sandra were in the tub and the bottle was knocked over due to the movement of the water, I doubt they would have continually placed the bottle back on a shelf that would have simply allowed it to fall over again. Whilst there were many items around the top of the jacuzzi, there was also plenty of space for two more small containers. So it seems like an interesting choice. Many people have asked the valid question, how can the bottle standing upside down on the inner shelf have withstood the movement of the water and remained standing? Or why would an intruder pick up the bottle from in the water and put it upside down on the shelf? There's been multiple discussions about the water level of the tub. And the water level is important because if you look at the photos, you'll notice the level of the water with respect to the jets. Now, some of the jets are partially exposed to the air. Well, why is that important? Well, members of ours have conducted various demonstrations showing both the noise and the amount of splash from a jacuzzi when jets are exposed to air and when they're at the water level. The spray of water from the jets is significant because we don't see anything suggesting that the water was sprayed around the bathroom in that way. The candles remain lit, the containers all look to be in their place and not knocked over. And we can say that the tiles look dry, but of course it's hard to know whether all of the water that would have sprayed clear of the jacuzzi would have dried. And remembering that we have no way here of determining when the jets were eventually stopped or turned off that night, if they were in fact running at all. Now, if they were turned on, we do know that they were stopped sometime before Sandra's discovery, because they were not running when law enforcement arrived at the house. And we do have one other way to tell, the paper bag from CVS, which is sitting on the tiles next to the bath. It doesn't appear to have been soaked with water and then dried. So, you could rightly ask the question, if the jets were running that evening without anyone in the jacuzzi and the water was spraying around as it would have done with the water at that level, why do we not see any evidence of it? So then we can look at the water level, because of course it could be claimed by some that the actual water level was above the jets while the jets were running, meaning that the water might not have sprayed around as we describe it. There have been some good points raised about the possibility of either a slow leak or the water level dropping through evaporation. And we have two references for the water level. We know that the water level when Sandra was discovered, because we have the photos. We also know that if the jacuzzi was occupied that previous night, the water level with two adults in the water had to be below the level of the inner shelf. If it wasn't, there's no way the bottle standing upside down could have been in that position. So that gives us a very small difference of water height to consider. And different things impact on the rate of water evaporation. And the circumstances we have here are likely climate-controlled home, not extreme levels of humidity or heat or direct sunlight or wind. The actual rate of evaporation would have had very little effect on the height of the water over that relatively short period of time. And a leak from the plug or through another area of the jacuzzi is possible, and we can't determine whether that's actually the case in this instance. But again, we have the bottle standing upside down to give us guidance on what the maximum height of the water could possibly have been. The water could not have been evaporating or leaking out at too quick a pace. Otherwise, the original water level, when according to Sandra, Jim and her were taking a spa together, would have been over that inner shelf, causing that bottle to fall. We can then look at the displacement of water of two adults. And humans displace water at approximately the same rate as their weight. So a person weighing 125 pounds will displace approximately 125 pounds worth of water. Now I say approximate because there can be very slight differences based on body fat, but not enough to have a meaningful impact on the rate for the purposes of our discussion here. Now Jamie's weight is known, 125 pounds or 56 kilos. And Sandra's weight at the time of her murder has been estimated by various people on the pages associated with Bob's show at 145 pounds or 65 kilos. and this gives us a combined weight of approximately 270 pounds, or 121 kilos. So this equates to water displacement of approximately 32 gallons, or 121 litres of water, with both of them fully submerged. So if you minus an amount for the head and arms and perhaps part of their upper chests and shoulders, 26.5 gallons, or 100 litres, in total displacement would be a pretty conservative estimate. Now, we did a search for jacuzzis of a similar style to the Melgars jacuzzi and found a style of jacuzzi which appears to closely match it. And based on the photos, I believe it is a very similar size to the Melgars jacuzzi. The specifications for this jacuzzi indicate that it has a total water capacity of 55 gallons, or 208 litres. For those interested, the style of jacuzzi which we think is very similar is a Curaçao 58-inch by 58-inch corner whirlpool jetted bathtub. Now consider adding 26.5 gallons, or 100 litres of water, to a jacuzzi that has a total water capacity of only 55 gallons, or 208 litres, and that already has a lot of water in it. The additional gallons will make a very significant difference to the overall level of the water. And based on that, I find it difficult to imagine how the water level could have been much higher than what we were observing in the photos without disrupting the items on that inner shelf when Jim and Sandra were in the jacuzzi. It's actually my feeling that adding the 26.5 gallons, being the displacement from Sandra and Jim, would likely have resulted in the water level increasing over the inner ledge anyway, which raises the question of how the scene we observe could actually be if the events as described actually took place. Continuing with the jacuzzi, take note of the layout of the jacuzzi and where Sandra claims that she was sitting. And we'll address this more when we closely look at Sandra's interview with Detectives Carazal and Doucet, but briefly, Sandra refers to how she fell whilst trying to get out of the jacuzzi that night, and describes how Jim grabbed her arm to support her. Importantly, she describes how Jim grabbed her right arm. And whether it's the left or the right arm is relevant, because you may be aware, and again we'll cover it more in future episodes, but Sandra has a bruise on her left upper arm near her bicep. So just briefly picture this. Sandra is getting out of the tub, and to get out to the right, she has to turn her body to the right to step out. Jim at this point is closest to her left arm. So if Sandra slips or stumbles, it will be her left arm that Jim would grab. It would be incredibly awkward for Jim to grab her right arm, and that would provide little or no support to her. Also note that there is no bruise on her right arm, the arm Sandra claims that Jim grabbed to support her, and you also recall it has been claimed that Sandra bruises easily. If it seems inconsistent, that is because it is. It doesn't seem to all fit together, and we'll address that at length in future episodes. Continuing now this episode, we'll leave the master bathroom and we'll move on to the master bathroom closet. Bob describes the closet as being a very strange scene, but I think that insinuates something sinister, when I don't think that's necessarily accurate. In fact, I believe the master bathroom closet, Sandra's closet, is actually indicative of the state of the rest of the house. And not being critical in any way, just saying that the lack of organisation in the closet is perhaps an indication of how other parts of the house were kept. And Bob notes that the closet is jam-packed, and that's accurate. There are a lot of different items stored on the shelves, on the ground, on the dresser, and in the plastic drawer unit. And Bob hones in specifically on the northeast corner of the top closet shelving, where he describes a 2-foot length of shelf that is completely empty. And that's true. Beneath that section of shelving are some boxes on the floor of the closet and a box on the top of the dresser, which may at some point have been up on that top shelf. What is important to note here, and which Bob doesn't draw attention to, but which the photos clearly demonstrate, is the general state of the closet. Items are not neatly stacked on the shelves, far from it. In fact, in many sections it appears that just empty paper shopping bags have been stored on the shelves, along with clothing, some folded, some unfolded, and handbags. It appears to be kept in an entirely unorganised state. Not ransacked, just that things have not been carefully stored or put away. And Bob notes here that the presence of the bag on the floor is, and to quote, a pretty interesting detail if someone was just staging this crime scene. Now, if the closet and the house generally was kept in a strictly organised state, then perhaps you could extend the speculation to that level. But given what we see generally, I don't think a bag on the floor is necessarily indicative of anything, including of the scene being staged. I think it is how the closet actually is and how the room was generally kept. But if you do believe it is a representation of an intruder searching through the closet, consider a couple of things. What level of sophistication would it take to pull down some boxes from a corner of the shelf and let them fall to the ground? Secondly, think through the timeline of how that would occur and consider the size of the closet. As it's suggested by Sandra in one of her subsequent variations of her memory of that evening, that her last memory is of sitting on the chair in the closet applying lotion. Then we know that Sandra was discovered bound in that closet by Herman and Maria. This is where the timeline becomes interesting about when the closet was actually searched through. Now, it's a very small closet, even less space if you consider that a dining chair was supposedly regularly kept in there. Then also look at all of the handbags, the boxes and the shopping bags that appear completely undisturbed and not searched through. We have a scene where a small number of boxes have potentially been removed from the top shelf at some point in time, with one placed on top of the dresser with the contents still inside it, and at least one shopping bag on the floor of the closet, the contents of that appearing undisturbed. One of the most noticeable things I see in the closet is the ornate timber box sitting on top of the dresser. It's undisturbed, and we know that because there is a handbag and a plastic Ziploc bag containing toiletries sitting on top of it that are both undisturbed. Now, the lid to the box is closed and the drawer is only slightly open, and it wouldn't be able to be pulled further out without causing items to fall off the dresser. Now, interestingly, draped over the ornate box is a black piece of material resembling a fabric belt or a tie. Of note is this piece of material has a knot tied in the middle of it. It's also one of several pieces of similar material that can be found scattered throughout the closet, including several similar fabric belts or ties and at least one scarf on the ground near the closet door. Now, Bob wraps up the analysis of the crime scene report of the closet at that point, and then he moves on to the master bedroom. We have quite a lot of material to cover with respect to the master bedroom, so we will leave that until next week. Thank you very much to all of our listeners for your fantastic contributions on our Facebook page and the productive discussions being carried on there. We truly appreciate all the feedback we receive and the recognition that our process of setting the record straight is valued by so many. We look forward to you joining us next week on Truth is Justice as we continue to set the record straight.
Thank you.